Welcome back, and we are now going to dissect Donald Trump's much-awaited and anticipated 19-minute speech against a backdrop of high global oil prices and his own low approval ratings. We're going to be doing this with Professor Patrick Bond. He's a distinguished professor of sociology. He is also a political economist, political ecologist, and scholar of social mobilization. Lovely to be talking with you once again, Professor Patrick Bond. Long time no speak. A very, very warm welcome to the show.
Assalamu alaikum. It's great to be back on Salam.
Walaikum salam. So let's look at the takeaways from Trump's speech on Iran. He staunchly defended his handling of the month-old U.S.-Israel war on Iran in a primetime address on Wednesday, saying that the U.S. military was nearing completion. He keeps saying that over and over again. However, this time again, he said they are nearing completion of its mission, whilst also reinforcing his threats to bomb the Republic to the Stone Age. Very, very strong words there. And I'm wondering, just how much of weight that carries. He's also promised boots on the ground. Nothing has happened yet. And if that does in fact happen, how devastating will that be for Iran, in fact? So over to you. Welcome once again.
Well, thanks. There's so many interesting processes. One is that in his speech, which you normally do with a certain respect for example, more than a dozen of the imperial powers service and the people killed in the first stage, the first 30 days. Normally you'd expect a sort of aura from a president, but he wasn't able to muster that. He was full of bluster instead and failed to provide any coherent explanation for the absolute chaos that not only exists now across West Asia, but for the whole world economy, even the US stock market. And that means the retirement accounts of people, but especially the higher prices of initially oil, now over $110 per barrel. Don't forget, it started at $70 per barrel at the end of February. So there's already that major it's more than a 55% increase in the price of oil, which then as it filters through into food, especially with the fertilizer shortage, as now the growing season in the Northern Hemisphere begins. This is a disaster, and it is a disaster for his November election plans. And I think he's trying to figure out some way to avoid holding an election in which he's not up for the presidency, but all of his members of the House of Representatives, 435 seats, and he could lose 45 or 50, as some of the estimates are. But his Senate, also the upper part of his parliament, he could lose that. And then he's got major problems with especially impeachment hearings and investigations into all of the corruption that we've just seen in the past year and 3 months of his second term. This is a disaster looming for him. And what he needed to do was come out with some quick victory, the way he did in Venezuela, quickly going in, kidnapping a leader and arranging a regime change of sorts, even though the vice president took over. Certainly, it's a very different government in Venezuela, one that, for example, just sent oil to Israel as its first freedom to send oil. Of course, the US had such a huge lock on Venezuela, as they do now as well, on oil coming into Cuba. Only a couple of Russian ships have been brought in. But then we've got the last couple of days, Julie, the fact that two airplanes were shot down, the F-15, the F-10, and that's very important to show that in spite of a claim that there's complete command of the air over Iran, that's not the case. And indeed, one of the soldiers who was, or the pilots from the second of these planes, who did eject and was badly injured. And there was a real question, maybe would be taken captive by Iranians in the south west of the country. And instead, the US, with Israel's help, they were able to get that pilot out yesterday. The other major thing is that, there is that threat to put boots on the ground, as you ask. That would be a disaster, which would lead to many, many scores or hundreds or maybe thousands of US troops being threatened, maybe injured, possibly killed, because the Iranians have such effective drones. So if they land on some of the islands in the Persian Gulf, or begin to take some space coming probably from the Iraqi side. They'll be met with this million-strong army, well armed. The Iranians would probably very quickly create some casualties that Donald Trump would find unbearable. And then, of course, he's just got the air power. And that means, as he said yesterday, if you don't open, he used an expletive to describe the Strait of Hormuz, you crazy, another expletive, then you'll find what hell looks like. So he is still threatening massive destruction, war crimes, without a doubt, of the civilian energy supply. That would be the major power plants. They're already much reduced, probably down to about 10%, as well as probably water, sanitation. These are the sorts of targets that Netanyahu and Trump have in mind, that if they aren't able to get some sort of concession by Iran playing very tough and saying, no, we can control the Strait of Hormuz. And that's what really the ultimate pressure is, until we get some of our agenda, which is long-term security guarantee and reparations for the massive damage done. That is, as I see it, a sort of tug of war, and both sides have extraordinary powers of destruction, and neither side is giving it.
So, Professor Bond, in your opinion, we've been getting different scenarios from different people regarding the United States' involvement and support of Israel in this war against Iran. What's in it for the United States, number one? And we also look at the issue around the neighbors, the Muslim neighbors of Iran. Up to now, they haven't really been, I guess, they haven't really said much or done much. Is there a possibility that they could get dragged into or voluntarily involve themselves in this war and side with the United States? How catastrophic will that be, not only for the Middle East, but for the globe?
Yes, just on the first question, it's always a mystery what drives Donald Trump, because the tendencies to find geopolitical or narrow economic interests fall apart when you're dealing with somebody with psychoses and mental illnesses, as Trump appears to have. Witnessed that Truth Social madman commentary yesterday. However, one theory is that Israel is really pulling the strings, and that the crucial transmission belt for Israel is the pair, Steve Witkoff and the former real estate developer and Trump's golfing partner with no experience in diplomacy, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who's also a real estate developer. And as you recall, they've got grand plans for Gaza to make it the Riviera of the Middle East. Now, these sorts of framings that Israel does have extraordinary power is undeniable, because, for example, John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt's book about the Israel lobby, it's called AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, is demonstrating that the Congress and many of the other major parts of the government, even the presidency, because Miriam Adelson was the second largest donor after our own South African Elon Musk. And so when you think about yanking money, putting up primary candidates against some of the members of Congress who aren't so strongly pro-Israel, that is power. The second is that Trump and his mates want to control the world's oil. And those are the big US oil companies that gave him reportedly $1 billion. That's what he had asked for. And he said, look, everything will go well. And in fact, with the price of oil up, there'll be windfall profits. But control of oil and maybe lowering the amounts of oil coming out of national competitors like the Qatar and the Saudi Aramco and the other UAE, the other big oil companies, for the U.S. companies, ExxonMobil and Conoco and some of the others. That's a very important part of the equation. A third is to put a sort of stranglehold on China, which is the main consumer of the Persian Gulf's oil. And the Strait of Hormuz now is open to ships carrying oil to China, but that may not last forever. And the whole point, I think, of Trump's vision provided by Netanyahu is that they would take over Iran quickly. They'd find, once they killed the Ayatollah, they'd find some amenable people like they did in Venezuela. That is clearly not happening. So I think when we look at those three as the major forces, there's another theory, which is that Trump is simply making arguments about what will happen in the Gulf to suit his friends who are winning through fast trades on Wall Street. So there's a lot of questioning of the profiteering on Wall Street. So you can put a few of those arguments together, and probably each of them has a degree of coherence. Then you add the fact that the rest of the southern part of the Persian Gulf, and you've mentioned United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, to some extent Qatar, which hosts the biggest US base, and then there's Bahrain, Kuwait, and Iraq, and then across then the other side, Oman and Yemen. Now, Saudis haven't fought very well against Yemen. They haven't been able to, in spite of a war that killed some 400,000 Yemenis, they haven't been able to have their way in Yemen. The Houthis are now able to close the Red Sea as well, and that would hurt Saudi Arabia because the pipeline that it has to take oil out of the Red Sea would then be useless. Well, they can still go through the Suez Canal up north. But I think the crucial factor is that UAE and Saudi Arabia have leaders, Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Salman, who really do want to get rid of the Iranians. And they've been saying, it's been reported, I certainly believe what I've seen, that they'd like to see Trump move in all the way and, quote, finish the job. And I think that is, to answer your second question, a terrible mistake, because there isn't really much to the UAE beyond the immigrant workers, the fancy buildings, the financial markets, the diamond trades, the oil and the gas. And there's this image for tourists of the UAE as a desirable place, and especially in Dubai where alcohol is available. And I think that's all gone now. The huge airline, Emirates, grounded. That is the biggest airport in the world. Another big airport in Abu Dhabi, another in Qatar, the Doha airport. And those other national airlines also damaged now tremendously. So these are huge costs. And I think at some point, some wise person's got to be able to say, hey, stop, we've done enough damage to each other. It's time at least for a ceasefire, but hopefully that they can get some sort of long-term peace agreement in which no more overthrows of Iran, no more bombings by Israel. And then, of course, the open question is what that would mean for the Palestinian cause, for the some wanting a two-state, some wanting a broader one-state democratic solution. What would happen depending upon how this war plays out? We still can just imagine the balance of forces, but Donald Trump has weakened himself. The Russians are probably coming out strongest. The Chinese are hurting. Most of East Asia is hurting. Look, in Africa, those on the East Coast are having major cues. The price increases will now follow through, as I say, to food and fertilizer. Interest rates will probably be put up to fight inflation, more defaults, and it's a disastrous set of, a string of events that Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu have kicked into action.
And of course, the effects are absolutely global. All of us are hurting and will continue to hurt for a long time to come. There has been suggestions that one of the reasons why Trump has gone into Iran was to take away the focus from the Epstein files. Do you truly believe that, the disclosure of the Epstein files was that big a deal that he had to actually go to war, to Iran, to go on war with Iran to take away the focus? And do you believe that this would hold him in good stead? Question number one. We're going to have to wrap up in a short while. And then let's look at the Ukrainian situation. That has gone under the radar, and so has the Palestinian issue. Surely once the dust settles on the Iranian situation, whatever the outcome, please God, let it be positive for the Iranians. Once again, we're going to see things, the killings have not stopped in Gaza. The misery, the hardship, and the oppression has not stopped on the people of Gaza. That will continue, possibly, be ramped up, undoubtedly. And then the Ukrainian situation, how is that playing out? Are they winning? Are they seeing some improvement in their situation? And how is the current situation impacting on Ukraine, or vice versa?
Well, just on that last question, it is terribly important, of course, that the wars these days are now being fought with drones, and that the Iranians supplied the Russians. And as a result, the Ukrainian defense has become quite sophisticated in identifying how to shoot down drones. So that means Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian leader, is now talking to Gulf states. He's in the pro-US camp. He's pro-Israel. It's a great shame because it is a situation where you can see lots of different divisions of ideology. But one such division is that Putin's invasion was illegal. He's run out of steam. He lost many of his troops in the very first run when he tried to line up troops down that highway right into Kiev, coming into the suburbs, but then being pushed back. And then he took a lot of ground, but then lost a great deal of it in late 2022, and then has not made much progress, if any. And what the point is of this is that those Iranian drones that the Russians were able to use now aren't that effective, and that the Iranian drones that go back into the Russian lines are seemingly more effective. So in that battle of the drones, it is interesting that Zelensky is trying to bring his support now to the Gulf states. But I was mentioning the other winners, and it is terribly important, isn't it, that we have profiteers in South Africa. Let me name them. Patrice Motsepe is the head of African Rainbow Minerals. He's suggested as the logical replacement for his brother-in-law as president of the ANC at the end of next year, and maybe president of the country in the 2029 election. Now, his name, Patrice Motsepe, he is not yet identified in the public's mind as a profiteer from this massive destruction, but the price of coal has gone from $100 to over $120 per ton, and Richards Bay is steaming out coal that is lined up on ships that are headed over to Israel, because if Israel loses its the main gas field called the Leviathan, and if it loses maybe from Hezbollah or Iranian bombs the refining that it has in the Haifa port area, well, then it's going to really need those two big coal-fired power stations. And as we now see energy under attack, it really, I think, is a crucial moment for South Africans to say, why would both President Ramaphosa's brother-in-law and his old allies in Glencore, the probably most corrupt company in Africa's history, given all of the prosecutions, the information we've received. Jill Marcus, who was formerly Reserve Bank governor, formerly Mandela's speechwriter, is on the board. Gary Nagel from Johannesburg is the CEO. We do have a really serious problem, and there are wonderful protesters from BDS out to regularly approach it, and a major report that Seyhan Che Khan filed with colleagues last week with Parks Tao, the trade minister. And I think that gets us to that bigger, broader question of whether the Epstein empire includes these kind of characters like the Glencores, who had some connections to Epstein. And I just don't know. I think you're right to ask whether this is a wag the dog. That's what they named Bill Clinton's similar, although much less serious, episode when he was caught with a young intern, Monica Lewinsky. And then to distract attention, he bombed a Sudanese pharmaceutical factory and created a little war. And there's a sort of movie, Wag the Dog, that tells you what that's about. I think there is probably something there. And the firing of his attorney general, Pam Bondi, by Donald Trump in the last couple of days is another indication that this is not going well, because she had really messed up on her partial release of the files and some of the revelations that are still there. About 3 million of the files are still not released, and it does, I think, impinge upon Trump for the period ahead, that he'll probably lose the MAGA base, Make America Great base, the people who really thought that this kind of Zionist, because Epstein is always rumored as a Mossad operative, and his connections to Ehud Barak, the former Israeli prime minister, and the extent to which Epstein had captured in his lair the likes of the Clintons, of Bill Clinton, and of Prince Andrew, and so many others, Bill Gates, that really should have known better. And then, indeed, Donald Trump was his bestie, his best friend during the 90s. And there's no question that until about 2005, they were very tight. Melania and Trump met on the Epstein Lolita Express. And I think there are some big questions. Hopefully, if the dust settles in Iran, we'll see some tougher questions being asked, and the US populace now being able to focus on what kind of a man Donald Trump was and is, especially with a 13-year-old testifying, as these Epstein files indicate, that she was raped by Trump.
Pardon, I did say it was my final question, but I can't let you go without any comment on Elon Musk. Your thoughts? I mean, he was very tight with Donald Trump for quite some time, and now it seems as if they're not besties any longer.
Well, you're right. They fell out in such a major way that Musk actually tweeted on his X.com, his social media outlet, that Donald J. Trump is in the Epstein files. Have a good day, DJT, said Musk when Musk left under conditions that he was unhappy with because he had not wanted to see a major tax cut, which raised the government deficit. He was a deficit cutter. And so he fell out with Trump over that, but they're back together. You can see that in the debate about what kind of Pentagon data collection and whether Grok, which is the AI device of X.com that Musk relies on. Just a final point is that I'm glad we've got actually a Namibia case just the last few days of rejecting Elon Musk's Starlink. And secondly, we have a fantastic campaigner, Eleanor Sisulu, who has developed a Stop Starlink movement here. And I'm hoping we get much more publicity over not just the merits of Musk, maybe with slightly cheaper rates and further reach because of his satellites that can go into the rural areas, but the huge costs, and those would include the costs of his surveillance. We know his hygiene with his data is very weak, and that the control and his connections to the Pentagon would put South Africa into a very bad position if indeed the Starlink comes here, regardless of the question of a 30% ownership or some other black empowerment deal. I think we just have to realize we have to apologize to the world. Yes, we did give the world Elon Musk, but we also gave the world the likes of Tyler and Trevor Noah. But I think that final point is we do have a much greater obligation to join the world campaign to defund Musk, to get off of Twitter. We don't have much in the way of Teslas here. The rest of the world had a big boycott against Tesla about a year or so ago that cost Musk about 100 billion of his personal wealth. But I think ultimately our strongest hand isn't really coming from Pretoria. Too much compromise. Talk left, walk right. The hypocrisy is overwhelming with Ramaphosa and his Glencore and his brother-in-law sending call. But we have to do much more from the grassroots base, from people listening to you now from the Muslim community, to put pressure on not just Glencore and ARM, but all of the coal companies that benefit from sending the coal to Israel, because it is really deadly and it's bouncing back with this war and costing us enormously here in South Africa.
And like you said, hats off to organizations like BDS who are putting lots of pressure regarding coal to Israel. We're going to have to leave it there. Always a pleasure talking with you. I do hope we'll talk some more regularly in the future. Go well and God bless.
Same to you. Thank you.
It is exactly 9:44, and we're going to be wrapping up with an environmentalist. She's an activist as well, and I so look forward to this interview. She's going to talk to us about waste management in a very big way. Her name is Roxy du Plessis.